Hi, I'm Janice Neitzel of Sustainable Solutions Group. So you're wondering what a supply chain animal welfare assessment is, and even more importantly, do you need it? Let's go ahead and take a look. At Sustainable Solutions Group, we have an international team with Dr. Temple Grandin as our primary advisor. We have animal welfare PhDs on our team. Here are some of the primary services we offer, and today we're going to look at the one in the middle, the meat, dairy, and egg animal welfare assessment. So as a food company, where are you in animal welfare? Do you consider yourself doing business as usual or a fast follower? Maybe you're a leader or an innovator. It's important to decide where you think you fall so that you can decide what your goals are for an animal welfare assessment. For someone who's business as usual or a fast follower, your goal might be meeting your commitments and satisfying regulations without increasing costs. You might want to incrementally improve animal welfare in your supply chain. If you're a leader or innovator, increasing supply of higher welfare animal proteins for some of your brands might be your focus, and then stepping up to wholly improving animal welfare in your supply chain. Different brands and different food companies fall in these different boxes. You won't be all of them. We're going to take a look at, if you need a supply chain animal welfare assessment, we're going to look at credible brand risks and then talk about what is a supply chain animal welfare investment. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and send those to my email ID on the screen. So do you need a supply chain animal welfare assessment? There are two main pieces to look at. An animal welfare assessment will formally communicate expectations to your suppliers and vendors. It will also formally measure progress of your supplier and vendors of the credible brand risks that we're going to take a look at. Let's take a look at the first one. You need regularly scheduled and consistent methods of supplier communication to show you're serious. You're not operating in a vacuum. You are one of many restaurant and food companies asking suppliers for the same animal welfare improvements. Your suppliers and vendors need to hear consistent, well-timed messaging of your needs and expectations. Let's take a look at the second part, measuring the credible brand risks. Poor animal welfare and antibiotic overuse are credible brand risks in your supply chain. You need a formal plan for annually assessing your supplier and vendor progress. Consistent annual measurement of your supplier and vendor progress demonstrates your commitment and communicates your needs and expectations. Let's take a look at some of the credible risks to your brand. With COVID-19, the impact is that there is increased consumer awareness of animal welfare. Experts are warning that intensive farming methods and misuse of antibiotics increases the risk of diseases spreading from animals to humans. The Business Benchmark for Animal Welfare says that food companies will redouble their attention on food supply chain risk management, focus on animal welfare standards and traceability so that they can reassure their customers that they are effectively managing these. A former JBS sustainability director spoke to the National Restaurant Association and said that there are three things that are most important to consumers and stakeholders after COVID-19. One is a resilient supply chain, two is team member health and safety, and three is the welfare of animals raised for food. Let's take a look at U.S. regulatory requirements that are coming up January 1st, 2022, in particular for California and Massachusetts. In the United States, different states are undertaking different animal welfare regulations. You'll see that the green marks pork and eggs, and the light blue marks eggs. So in California, Proposition 12, and in Massachusetts, Question 3, effective January 1st, 2022, any pork or eggs grown or served in those states need to be cage-free and crate-free. And in the next slide, we're going to look at that a little closer. All of these other states have cage-free egg laws that are coming up on different dates. And there are more states that are going to be passing cage-free egg laws. So let's take a look at this. For pork, here's a comparison of the breeding pig space that's going to be needed. A gestation crate is 14 square feet, and in that individual crate, that breeding sow can't turn around. In these middle columns, we're looking at the Massachusetts law and at the California law. The Massachusetts law is requiring 20 square feet of floor space per sow, and this is what is current U.S. group housing and the raised without gestation crate label. In California's Prop 12, it's 24 square feet of floor space needed, and this is the same as in the European Union requirement. I'm also showing that Trader Joe's has taken a step to create a brand that not only is crate-free for gestation breeding pigs when the pig is pregnant and there are no piglets, but also for the farrowing stage after the piglets are born. The cage-free egg laws are even more complicated. In the first two columns, you'll see California Prop 12 and Massachusetts. You'll see for California, there was already some requirements, and in January 1st, 2022, the cage-free law goes into place for any eggs that are grown or served or sold in California. For Massachusetts, the space requirements are a little different, and the start date is the same, January 1st, 2022. In these other states, there are different space requirements and different dates. And there are also other states that are going to be having upcoming requirements. This is complex, and these are credible brand risks that you need to be checking with your suppliers to make sure that you are getting the cage-free eggs you need in the states where you need them at the right time. Other credible brand risks are your policies and commitments. You may have policies or commitments that you've made publicly. They may or may not be on your website. Even if they are not on your website, there are NGO groups that are tracking the public commitments for cage-free eggs, for crate-free pork, for broiler chickens, and you'll see the links at the bottom of the screen where these are being tracked. So NGOs are tracking the commitments that you've made, even if these commitments were made years ago. Let's take a look at NGO and investor reporting. There are reports of progress now available to investors and consumers with the click of a button. The Business Benchmark on Farm Animal Welfare is a global report, and this has been being put out for a number of years, reporting on what you are reporting on your farm animal welfare progress on your website. There's the Fair Protein Producer Index, and this is being provided specifically to investors. NGOs are getting involved. HSUS now has a food industry scorecard. World Animal Protection is looking at the progress for breeding pigs and broiler chickens in their quit stalling report and in the pecking order report. While the chain reaction, which is put out by Consumers Union, NRDC, and a consortium of NGOs, is measuring meat antibiotic use. You may appear in one of more of these reports that is charting the progress that NGOs are aware of. It may or may not be accurate based on if you are communicating with NGOs or not. The ASPCA is informing its 2.5 million members of animal welfare certified brands. So they are pointing their members to specific places to buy these animal proteins that have these certifications. Let's look at the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. A lot of food companies use the 5 freedoms as the foundation of their animal welfare policy. And we're going to want to take a look at where there's non-conformance to these 5 freedoms that puts you at credible brand risk. Here are the 5 freedoms. You may be familiar with these. They were put together by the RSPCA in the UK years ago. And following these 5 freedoms of animal welfare may even appear on your website as the foundation of your animal welfare policy, as many companies are doing. There are standard industry practices that do not conform to the requirements of the 5 freedoms. For eggs, hens are living in tight cages. Male chicks are disposed of in grinders because they are not considered viable to raise for meat. For pork, breeding pigs are living in the gestation crates 24/7 until they have the piglets, then they're being moved to farrowing crates. Piglets are going through piglet thumping, which is where they are killed because they are considered smaller or not viable. And there's a picture of this on the right. It's not pretty, and your customers and investors may be seeing these pictures and videos on social media. Poultry, the main concern there is the rapid growth. Also, fast line speeds at slaughter because poultry are excluded from the U.S. Humane Slaughter Act. With dairy cows, biological overload is causing lameness, as well as the cows primarily living on concrete and in freestall barns where the stalls may be smaller because the equipment is upgraded every 10 years, but the cows may be bred bigger and bigger. And this is where Dr. Temple Grandin says we need to be breeding for optimum productivity, not for the highest level of productivity. In dairy, there's also the problem of disposable male calves. Male calves don't give milk. What is happening to the male calves? Then we have lack of on-farm pain management for different procedures that are done to the animals. These are standard industry practices, and they go against the 5 freedoms. You want to find out, are your suppliers using these practices, and are there plans to change them? In the animal welfare assessment, we check to see what are the practices being used, and then have discussions based on what do you want to know and what kind of decisions would you make having this information. On social media, as there's been for a long time, there are undercover farm investigations showing poor conditions when the animals are crowded and they cannot exhibit their natural behaviors. Stalls and cages that are too small, from rubbing up against the cages, they might get body lesions and wounds. It's not easy to move a cow or to move a lot of chickens. And if the proper training is not provided, workers may have difficulty in handling and moving the animals that could lead to unintended cruelty. This lack of training, or maybe they're not trained in their native language, causes concern and brand risks. Management needs to be setting the proper example at all times for their workers to know what's most important. Industry practices such as tail cutting, piglet thumping that we mentioned, electric prods, this is being done without pain mitigation and many times. And so electric prods, for instance, there's better ways of doing it, of moving the cattle along, and can it be done that way rather than with the electricity shock? So these are the things that your consumers and investors are learning about in these types of videos. You need to know what's happening in your supply chain. So let's talk about what is a supply chain animal welfare assessment. Like Dr. Temple Grandin says, you manage what you measure. If it's important enough to measure, you will manage it. A supply chain animal welfare assessment is an iterative process that happens over time. It causes incremental animal welfare improvements from year to year. And what we do is an initial sourcing assessment that then lets us set goals and strategies like we had talked about earlier. Your goal may be to meet your commitments without additional cost. Your goal may be to improve animal welfare for some of your brands. And then you can advertise those brands as having animal welfare certifications. We figure out what those goals are. We recommend your key performance indicators, do the measurements, and then we help you with communicating to all the different stakeholders. You would communicate differently to NGOs than you would to your customers. Your staff needs to know what's going on. What is the message that you want your staff that would be customer facing to, what kind of knowledge base would you want them to have and what messaging so that they can communicate to customers successfully. What we do to start is we establish the 5 Freedom KPIs. With those key performance indicators, we customize that according to what your goals are. And we have the assessment more or less thorough based on what your commitments and goals are. We use a supplier survey and we require supporting evidence for what your suppliers would reply. Then we measure the progress towards your policies and commitments, the upcoming regulations, investor expectations, and certification programs by producing graphs that show you where you are and what the gaps are. An animal welfare assessment benchmarks against your policies and commitments. An animal welfare assessment benchmarks against the state regulations. An animal welfare assessment benchmarks against investor and NGO expectations. And an animal welfare assessment measures your use of third-party certification programs so that we can understand which are credible, which ones are being used, which ones you would like to use. With the regulations, we look at regulations that are regional to where you have stores and restaurants. So if there are federal regulations, we look at those. If there are state regulations, and the reason I emphasize that here is because there are so many upcoming US state regulations that food companies may not be prepared for. In Europe, companies are more aware of what the regulations are because they've been in place longer, and it is more routine to check for those. Measuring prevents bad from becoming normal. There might be things going on in your supply chain that are not desirable, but if it's not routine, then we understand it's a one-off and can be corrected with corrective actions. What we don't want to have happen is you're not paying attention and don't understand, and bad is considered normal. We want higher animal welfare, and anything that would happen would be a mistake that can be corrected. Measuring communicates formally to your suppliers of your serious concern of credible brand risks. And we've looked at a lot of those in this presentation. Thank you so much for your time. Please send any questions you have to my email at janice@sussolutions.com. Thank you.